Kalorama, a recorded books hybrid imprint, presents The Search for Reagan, The Appealing Intellectual Conservatism of Ronald Reagan, by Craig Shirley. Read by Bob Johnson. Foreword by Mark Levin. Some of us are children of the Reagan Revolution. Both Craig Shirley and I traversed our own separate paths to Ronald Reagan, following this man and his conservative intellectual discipline along with others. And we are both better for it. And, by the way, America was better for it too. Reagan destroyed the Soviet Union. He created millions of new jobs. He created tens of thousands of millionaires. He eradicated inflation and high interest rates, and more importantly, he lifted the national mood, eliminating the malaise of the previous 4 years. Reagan has gone down in history as one of our 4 greatest presidents, alongside Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt, according to liberal historian John Patrick Diggins. All freed or saved many people, according to Diggins, and can one find a better reason to be president than to make people free and make their country a better place to live? Many young people go to Washington, get corrupted, and end up as sad members of the Washington underclass. Neither Craig nor I ever intended to go to Washington to do anything other than follow our principles and take apart the Washington undergrowth. We wanted to join the Reagan Revolution, do our best, and then leave Washington behind. My journey started in Philadelphia when I tried, at 19 years old, to become a Reagan delegate to the 1976 GOP convention in Kansas City. Political bossism blocked my path that time, just as bossism blocked Reagan from getting the presidential nomination that time around. But 4 years later, nothing could stop him or me. He won in a landslide, and I went to work in the Reagan administration, first helping to dismantle the federal wasteland of action, just as President Reagan wanted. I ended up as the chief of staff to one of the greatest attorneys general in American history, the wonderful Ed Meese. I was honored, and, as a bonus, he had been a close friend and philosophical soulmate to Reagan for many years. So I reasoned that if I was helping the president's dear friend, I was helping Ronald Reagan. Those were the halcyon days for all of us, the young Reaganites, and Reagan was a romantic, seeing freedom conquering slavery, knowledge devouring ignorance, and his life as a struggle against the dark forces of collectivism. He often quoted the founders and framers, the men of the Enlightenment, C.S. Lewis, Locke, Churchill, and Thoreau, who once said, "The character inherent in the American people has done all that has been accomplished, and it would have done more, if the government had not sometimes gotten in the way." Reagan mobilized rhetoric into an actual political, economic, and cultural idea, assembling it into a firm and logical conservative philosophy. There was an allure to being a Reaganite. We knew we were right. Individualism and privacy have always ruled the day, and Reagan was its chief defender. Reagan left office more popular than when he entered the White House in 1981. My friend Craig has emerged as one of our finest American historians and one of the best of the Reagan biographers. He's written 6 books on Reagan, hundreds of op-eds, many speeches, and has taught about Reagan at University of Virginia, Georgetown, Hillsdale College, and Reagan's own Eureka College, to name just a few. He has also lectured many times at the Reagan Library. Just to put a fine point on his station as one of America's leading historians, he also authored the New York Times bestselling December 1941 and its sister book, April 1945, which was a Publishers Weekly bestseller. As death must with all men, we've lost Ronald Reagan, and he is badly missed. The next best thing now are books and articles written about the man from those who actually knew Reagan, like my friend Craig. Here is The Search for Reagan. Thank you. Mark Levin, Virginia, February 2023. Preface. Trust me, government asks that we concentrate our hopes and dreams on one man, that we trust him to do what's best for us. My view of government places trust not in one person or one party, but in those values that transcend persons and parties. Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was never as conservative as some conservatives wanted him to be, but he was as conservative as he felt comfortable being. The new Republican Party I envision will not be and cannot be one limited to the country club big business image. He believed in natural rights, as did the founder of modern conservatism, John Locke. He also believed in a natural aristocracy of men who rise to their highest ambition without the heavy hand of nobility or government interference, a la Thomas Jefferson. He quoted the founders and the framers often, much more than any recent president. Still, many books written by liberal historians during and immediately after his presidency gave short shrift to the man who won the Cold War and freed millions of people imprisoned behind the Iron Curtain, who restored American morale, and who solved high inflation and high interest rates while creating over 20 million new jobs. The net worth of families grew by 27%, and the real gross national product grew by 26%. The number of millionaires in America grew from 4,414 in 1980 to 34,944 in 1987. Those aforementioned books were derogatory, slanted, superficial, and not considered part of real history. These meaningless books include Ronald Reagan the movie, Our Long National Daydream, and Sleepwalking Through History. One of the worst books ever written about Reagan, ironically, was supposed to be his official biography, Dutch, by Edmund Morris. It wound up being a joke, with made-up characters and fake narratives. It was met with derisive reviews, sold poorly, and now can't even be found in the gift shop at the Reagan Library. It made a good doorstop, but that is all. More recently, books have been fairer to Reagan. Still, the left wing always knew that to destroy American conservatism, they needed to destroy the most successful conservative president in 20th century American history. Even Barack Obama acknowledged Reagan's impact on American culture and life. I think Ronald Reagan changed the trajectory of America in a way that Richard Nixon did not, and in a way that Bill Clinton did not. He put us on a fundamentally different path because the country was ready for it. I think they felt like, with all the excesses of the 60s and 70s, and government had grown and grown, but there wasn't much sense of accountability in terms of how it was operating. I think that he tapped into what people were already feeling, which was, we want clarity, we want optimism, we want to return to that sense of dynamism and entrepreneurship that had been missing. Interestingly enough, Obama communicated no new ideas as president. It simply was a continuation of the welfare state, guilty by his own indictment. Reagan, by like token, was an idea man, grabbing and embracing a new form of conservatism, pushing it out beyond its own previous boundaries. Reagan was just not an American conservative, a believer in a system in which power flows upward, but a new ideas conservative, promoting ideas such as tax cuts for the express purpose of restoring power to the individual, the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, enterprise zones, the Caribbean Basin Initiative, helping indigenous freedom fighters oppose communist tyranny, and much more. He introduced one new idea after another, and in so doing transformed the grand old party into a brand spanking new party. Too many people did not grasp that Reagan was not a reactionary, but instead a revolutionary. Many of the new ideas that came out of the 1970s conservative movement were inspired by Reagan and his speechwriting shop. Later, in the White House, that was, in essence, his brain trust, or in-house idea factory. Many of his best speechwriters had not been speechwriters before taking the jobs, demonstrating the flexible thinking of the Reagan administration. Two of his favorite speechwriters in the 1970s and beyond were Peter Hannaford and Ken Kachigin. Reagan was born in 1911, only a few years after Teddy Roosevelt had used the presidential bully pulpit to exhort America. TR once said, "The only true conservative sets his face toward the future." He was an American conservative who knew the world he lived in and what he could reasonably accomplish versus what he could not. Early on in his presidency, he got into a tiff with direct mail money man Richard Viguerie over his conservatism. History will show Reagan got the better end of the deal and the argument. He also criticized Viguerie in his private diaries, awarding him 2 entries. Richard Viguerie held a press conference along with John Lofton and blasted me as not a true conservative. Made me wonder what my reception would be at the conservative dinner, Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC. I needn't have worried. It was a love fest. Evidently, RV and JL don't speak for the rank-and-file conservatives. And again, received a letter from Richard Viguerie with a copy of Conservative Digest. He tried to write in sorrow, not anger about my betrayal of the conservative cause. He used crocodile tears for ink. Conservative Digest also lambasted Reagan as early as February 1982. The Reagan administration barely had a chance to clear its throat, but a small gathering of conservatives had jointly signed a document denouncing Reagan, including, paradoxically, Ron Robinson, who later became head of the Reagan Ranch. To be fair, Viguerie was a principled conservative who had supported Reagan for years, going back to 1965. As to why he ran for president, Reagan would often joke, "If you're not the lead sled dog, your view of the world never changes." But when he got philosophical and introspective, he once said that there was a feeling it was more than one wanting to be president, but rather than one should be president. In 1975, Time magazine said, "Republicans now must decide whether he, Reagan, represents a wave of the future or is just another Barry Goldwater calling on the party to mount a hopeless crusade against the 20th century." How wrong was Time magazine and the entire left-wing media establishment. Reagan was not a man of the past. He was a man of the future. As written in Rendezvous with Destiny, after 2 generations in which FDR's New Deal coalition dominated American politics, Reagan had emerged as the Republican answer to Roosevelt, a larger-than-life father figure who would bring his party out of the wilderness and demoralized Americans into the sunshine. Reagan, nicknamed Dutch by his father early on, and his brother Neil, a.k.a. Moon, who was 2 years older, grew up living the semi-idyllic Tom Sawyerish life of the typical small-town boy before the strident advent of radio, television, and the freeway. As of 1954, he was a washed-up actor who was almost broke. Once the boy darling of Hollywood and considered one of its most promising actors, he now, at his age, had few prospects to restart his movie career. And yet he was never callow, always reading and talking about politics and world affairs as a passionate supporter of Franklin D. Roosevelt. He once saw him in a parade in Des Moines, and later Harry Truman. He didn't even switch parties until 10 years later, and by 1980 he'd been a Democrat longer than a Republican. He was a deeply philosophical man, reading constantly and listening to thinkers and theorists of the right, such as Nobel Prize economist Milton Friedman, whom The Economist heralded as the most prominent economist of the 20th century, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, an intellectual who came out of Oklahoma and the Hell's Kitchen part of New York City. Another intellectual he listened to was Jean Kirkpatrick, a deep thinker who taught at Georgetown University and had once been a Hubert Humphrey Democrat. She came to Reagan's attention when she wrote an article titled "Dictatorships and Double Standards" for Commentary magazine. She also was from Oklahoma. The long article was a deep study of the current world situation vis-a-vis America's foreign policy. Reagan was greatly impressed and, in 1981, asked her to join his administration. Kirkpatrick had begun life as a traditional liberal, then moved to a neoconservative, neocon, and finally to a traditional conservative. In her final iteration of her life, she spoke often of freedom. She was also getting more involved, along with Richard Allen and others, in the Committee on the Present Danger, which put sunlight on the Soviet threat. Woodrow Wilson had the Inquiry, FDR had his Brain Trust and Dollar-a-Year Men, and JFK had the Harvard Mafia. But Reagan spent more time with intellectuals than did any other president. Reagan's candidacy and elections in 1980 and 1984 were dismissed by the left-wing intelligentsia as mere flukes, a sleight of hand, the wool pulled over the voters' eyes. Ronald Reagan's critics deride his abilities and presidency, referring to him as a cue card president who did little more than read lines written by others. But in fact, he won by landslides both times. They were some of the most impressive campaign wins of all time, rivaling FDR's. Of the 1980 election, George F. Will once said he regarded it as a national emergency. Reagan was also a man of letters, maybe more so than any other American president. He wrote letters in his youth, in his Hollywood salad days, as a governor, as a president, and right up to his time as a former president. Then he wrote one more letter, one last letter, telling the world he had Alzheimer's. As his friend Paul Laxalt, former governor of Nevada, said, "But Ronald Reagan's character, his warmth, his wisdom, and his philosophy of life all shine through the letters he writes to friends, to relatives, to other national leaders, and to strangers who have corresponded with him. He is a man who feels obligated to answer the appeals, requests, and compliments, as well as the criticisms and differences of opinion. He is one of the most prolific writers in American presidential history. Indeed, the Reagan Library in Simi Valley houses some 3,500 letters authored by the Gipper. All his letters were well written and thoughtful, with very few typos or errors of fact. He had a difficult time responding to tragedy, heartache, or loss, but reply this wordsmith did. Sometimes he would call rather than write. One hurting young woman wrote of her financial troubles. Reagan responded with a check, but the woman was going to frame it. When Reagan learned of this, he sent her a second check, but asked her not to cash both, just one of the checks. He was forever writing letters. But that wasn't enough. He also wrote the vast majority of his hundreds of radio scripts and an equal number of his columns, syndicated by King Features to hundreds of newspapers. It was not until after the turn of the century that Reagan's own extensive writings, radio commentaries, speeches, letters, began to be discovered and published. He would usually write about 15 of his radio addresses at a time, have them typed and cleaned up, and then record each 5-minute commentary in Harry O'Connor's studio at Hollywood and Vine. Then 15 reel-to-reels and 45s would be shipped out to about 300 radio stations nationwide. The Gipper had to be good at spotting issues and trends and making sure he did not do a recording of an issue that might fade in several weeks. But as chock full of facts as his radio addresses and columns were, he knew that he must cram stories, parables, anecdotes, and tales into his speeches to get his point across. As his Secretary of State, George Shultz, once observed, "Ronald Reagan's talents as a storyteller are legendary. He peppered his conversations with stories. Stories lent a certain informality and ease to his speeches. He used stories to increase his rapport with the people in front of him or on the other end of the television camera." One common story was that Reagan slept on planes, which was untrue. He opened up his briefcase and went right to work, reading, writing, editing. In fact, it was on a plane, according to longtime aide Mike Deaver, when he decided to run for president one more time in 1980. As he once said, "All in all, as I look back, I realize that my reading left an abiding belief in the triumph of good over evil." Most men reach a point at around 40 years of age where their politics and view of the world become fixed. They stop growing. Not Reagan. He was constantly evolving. Reagan's intellectual curiosity peaked later in life. The Reagan of the 1960s, often angry at student demonstrators, angry at recalcitrant college professors, angry at anti-war protesters, was more hopeful, more optimistic in his outlook by the late 70s. He also adjusted his politics from being just an beginner to being growth-oriented. His eye was now on the dawn rather than the dusk. It was noticeable. Conservatism, as defined by Reagan, was changing, historically and radically. As John Patrick Dickens wrote in Ronald Reagan, Fate, Freedom, and the Making of History, inspired by the libertarian views of Thomas Paine, Reagan saw himself as the lifeguard of American liberalism, rescuing it from drowning in the raging currents of radicalism that inundated 3 generations of 20th century history. In Hollywood in the 40s, Reagan the actor saw the old left's support of Stalin taint the New Deal. In Sacramento in the 60s, Reagan the governor heard the New Left's paeans to Castro and Mao. In Washington, D.C. in the 80s, Reagan the president watched the anti-war left's support for Nicaragua's Sandinistas sweep the academy. By then, the lifeguard had long given up on liberalism, which he concluded would always be swept away by the siren song of the left. There are plenty of doubters and left-wingers still around to down Reagan. One college professor wrote, without evidence it may be added, he rarely thought deeply or looked for ways to challenge or reassess his strongly held assumptions. Over the years, he repeated many false statistics and shared fanciful anecdotes to support conservative policies. And yet, the writer engages in the very thing he accuses Reagan of doing. He also writes of Reagan's shocking neglect of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s, completely overlooking the additional billions he devoted to AIDS research and how he raised it as an issue in a 1984 exchange with a reporter and again in his 1985 State of the Union address. That author also ignored how much he and Mrs. Reagan did for AIDS charities in their post-presidential years. Reagan had once been a big supporter of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. He cast his first vote in 1932 for FDR and voted for him another 3 times. He always remembered how his father and his brother got jobs from the Works Progress Administration, WPA, a New Deal-era bureau. He considered FDR to be his inspiration and always defended him, even as he slowly turned to intellectualism. Starting in the late 40s, Reagan began his historic move to the right as he battled communist provocateurs in Hollywood. At that time, he was in the 93% tax bracket. The government, led by the Democratic Party, was taking too much. The Democratic Party, once of the working man, of patriotism, was steadily moving to the left, to collectivism. By the early 1960s, Reagan had had enough and switched party registration. Other Democrats left also, while liberal Republicans, like New York Mayor John Lindsay, were leaving the Republican Party, thus beginning the process of making the GOP almost all conservative and the Democratic Party almost all liberal. As Reagan often quipped, "I didn't leave the Democratic Party, it left me." A staffer on his 1966 gubernatorial campaign noted dozens of highlighted books in Reagan's home library on political philosophy. In later years, the Democratic Party would only nominate national tickets that were left of center, and the Republican Party would only nominate tickets that were right of center. Reagan, the can-do optimist, would never accept collectivism as the final answer for mankind. He began his distrust of all forms of leftism, which started 30 years before his presidency, battling them and their groups in Tinseltown. Meanwhile, these communists saw the propaganda value of Hollywood and were dead set on taking it over. Reagan, like Thomas Paine, believed in hope, experiment, and freedom, but he also believed in challenging the status quo, reminding one of a letter written to Paine by Benjamin Rush, one of the most important founders. "The American war is over," Rush said, "but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. But unlike Paine, he believed God had a plan for him. He was also a child of the Enlightenment, suspicious of all concentrations of power, especially governmental and corporate. Reagan repeated Ralph Waldo Emerson often, America's early advocate of liberty and independence. In his seminal essay, Self-Reliance, Emerson called America the country of tomorrow, which Reagan quoted in his 1992 convention speech. Reagan also, on occasion, quoted from C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters and often cited the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The much-admired conservative syndicated columnist George F. Will once insightfully said of Reagan, "He did not shinny to the top of the greasy pole of American politics by accident or lassitude." And he accomplished big things during his presidency, including the defeat of Soviet communism, the restoration of American morale, and the creation of some 20 million new jobs. He also tamed inflation and high interest rates, which had been raging out of control under his predecessor, Jimmy Carter. In fact, under Carter, a new term came into being, stagflation. It meant low growth and high inflation, which economic textbooks said was impossible. Of his three great goals, Reagan knew American morale was the most important of all. A happy people are a productive people, and a productive people could manufacture the weapons he needed to aid indigenous freedom fighters around the world and grow an economy Reagan could use to bring the Soviets to heel. During his Grand Strategy campaign in 1980, which involved the interlocking causes of American morale and American productivity, he announced that the U.S. would defeat the Soviet Empire. Reagan despised Soviet communism and did all he could to destroy this evil empire. He made a pact with Pope John Paul II and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher to bring it down. Reagan sent the U.S.'s first ambassador to the Holy See and shared secret CIA information with Pope John Paul II. It helped tremendously that the Pope spoke English. Reagan and the Pope often conferred in private. For the first time in years, America was on offense against the Soviets. He saw it as a morality play. They were evil, and the U.S. was good. He used every means at his disposal, the bully pulpit, selling the Soviet shoddy equipment and spending them into oblivion, aiding pro-freedom movements such as the Contras in Nicaragua, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, and other movements in Hungary and the Baltics, the development of the Strategic Defense Initiative, which scared the hell out of the Soviets, and other forms of technology, Radio Free Europe and Vatican Radio, and everything and more at his command. Why, evil? The use of the word is key. No American president had ever described the Soviet Union as such, but Reagan knew what he was doing. He was marshaling his forces. Previously, the Soviets and communism had been winning since World War II, from the Warsaw Pact countries to building the Berlin Wall, to Korea, to Southeast Asia, to Cuba and the Baltics. Reagan and company stopped the Soviets dead in their tracks. For the first time in the history of the Cold War, the West, led by Reagan, was on offense. And we won the Cold War. Can you believe it? By 1988, an American president was in Moscow, standing before a statue of Lenin, lecturing an audience of college professors and college students on free market capitalism. Some philosophers will argue that man must slug his way from the swamp to the stars before being accepted by God. But Reagan rejected that Calvinist view of the world, believing that man has free will. And Reagan rejected the view that there was a hell. Reagan once said, "I can't believe an all-wise and loving Father would condemn any of his children to eternal damnation." While others say that suffering is not necessary and God loves all, regardless, they accept Jesus as their Lord. Philosophers and theologians love to argue how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, but Reagan was one who believed that heaven was open to all, although, just to be sure, you better live a good life. "In the beginning was the Spirit," Reagan said to the audience.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?